And she is one of the nation's key economic leaders making decisions affecting the finances of every American. A new book is taking a look at a fascinating closer look at Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen's impact on the economy, helping to steer the country through numerous and tumultuous economic twists and turns over the last 2 decades. And joining us now, senior writer for the Wall Street Journal, John Hilsenrath. He's the author of that new book entitled Yellen, the trailblazing economist who navigated an era of upheaval. And there's so much to talk about in terms of the economy, but I love what surprised you in your research. Tell us about that.
A love story. When she became Treasury Secretary, I said to myself, this is clearly a historic figure, really the Ruth Bader Ginsburg of economics. But what makes it a story worth reading is the love story, her relationship with her husband, George Akerlof, who won a Nobel Prize himself, a giant in economics, and became Janet Yellen's trailing spouse, who they met at the Fed in 1976, and they decided it was an equal partnership.
Just like everyone else. They meet at the Fed, you know.
Yeah, it's pretty heavy-duty conversations at the dinner table there, but it's a full-on partnership.
And go further with that, because this is actually, they're ahead of their time, and also it made many things possible for both of them.
Absolutely. And it's certainly in terms of the head of their time. And this is why the relationship is so interesting, because the husband, George, has always been ahead of his time in research, too. And so they got married in the late 1970s when, women were just kind of first coming into the workforce.
Barely.
Two-parent families were kind of just like people were figuring out how to do it, and they were figuring out how to do it. And they said from the very beginning, this is an equal partnership. Janet has kind of all the rights and privileges of the workplace, but George also has all the rights and privileges of being a parent. He picked Robbie, their son Robbie, up at school very often while she was working on a paper. And then when she got these jobs in Washington, the Treasury Secretary, the Federal Reserve Chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors, she's had all the top jobs. George said, yeah, I'll come along and I'll get dinner ready for you and you go do your job.
And she is, John, the first person, as you point out, in American history to have led all three of those, hold those positions that you just pointed out. So what is it about her, for people who don't know her story or really even her expertise, that makes her such a revered figure in Washington and in finance? Well,
one of the things I would say is a difficult mother. So in the sense that she had one.
Interesting.
So, one of the lessons from her work is do your homework. Anyone who's kind of been in an internal debate knows that she's always going to be the most prepared person in the room. Even to this day, she gets 300-page briefing books on Friday, takes them home over the weekend, reads them, and then comes back with questions. So her mother really pushed her as a child. She grew up in Brooklyn. To get not only have her homework done every night, but it had to be done correctly before she turned it in.
Wow.
So that's one of the big lessons for me from her career. But the other is have a purpose. She got all these top jobs, but she was never setting out to get the top job. She was always just setting out to do economics. And she's made some mistakes. We're living through inflation right now, so I don't want to give her a free pass on some of the turbulence we've lived through. But she was always working to get her economics right and not to get the next best job.
And speaking of economics, you do mention in the book that she did receive some criticism for her support of the American Rescue Plan, $1.9 billion. Some people thought that, maybe that was a reason why, inflation, became higher. Can you sort of talk through that and how her confidence and experience really reinforced her strong endorsement of this important policy?
Yeah, I mean, this was a really kind of important and difficult episode in American history. And, I think what happened was Washington, not just Yellen, but even before Yellen, the Trump administration was fighting the last war. So after the 2007-2008 financial crisis, we went through this long period of very high unemployment. People were comparing it, saying this is potentially the next Great Depression. And so they were afraid, the policymakers in Washington were afraid we were going to return to another period of very high unemployment. And they said, we have to throw everything we can at this problem, including the Federal Reserve, which she used to lead. So they pushed interest rates very low. They did all kinds of programs that make Wall Street crazy every day, quantitative easing. We don't need to get into that. But they threw so much money at the economy, and it was one factor. There were other factors, supply chain problems, war in Ukraine, but it was one factor that led to this inflation. And they were really guided by what had happened in the decade before that. There's this idea in psychology called recency bias, where you make judgments for today about what most recently happened to you. And that was the period we lived through, high unemployment. And so they set out to end that, and we got inflation instead.
The new book is entitled Yellen, the trailblazing economist who navigated an era of upheaval. Great personal and professional stories about this incredibly impactful woman. Senior writer for the Wall Street Journal, John Hilsenrath, thank you very much for being on this morning. We appreciate it.